Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the fifth LGMA webinars towards COP Climate COP26. My name is Yunus Arikan. I'm the Director of Global Advocacy at ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability. I'm also the focal point of local government and municipal authorities constituency. As we mentioned, this is the fifth round of our webinar, and today is 17th of June, which is also a global observation for the desertification and drought day. And considering a number of ongoing processes on climate, nature, and land, and particularly for the observance of this day, we have split this climate-specific LGMA monthly webinars with a specific focus on climate, nature, and land. Today in the 10 o'clock session now, we are starting with an update on our progress in the climate space, but we will have much more specific discussions on the biodiversity process, especially the Edinburgh process. And in the afternoon at 4 p.m., we will be focusing a bit more on the desertification and the synergy between the three processes. Before presenting my colleagues today's webinar, I just would like to give you a couple of technical information for those who are attending new. This webinar is recorded, and the recording will be uploaded on the YouTube later on that everybody will be able to access. You can type your questions during the webinar. We are aiming to have a Q&A session. And that will be the moment where you can point your contributions, or you can address your questions. And during the Q&A session, we can all unmute you. But at the beginning, we would like to make sure that you are muted so that the session can flow smoothly. So with this, let me go to today's agenda. As you may have seen now on screens, I am delighted that in this webinar, I am joined by our colleagues Ingrid Kotze, Senior Program Manager from ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Center. She's also the member of the Convention on Biodiversity, Biological Diversity Informal Advisory Group on Mainstreaming Biodiversity. Ingrid is joining us from Cape Town. I'm also delighted to welcome also John Mowat from Marine Scotland, Marine Planning and Policy of Scottish Government UK. He's obviously joining from Scotland. So if you have noticed, I think we are now having that advantage of, or the privilege as the climate community, to be informed from the best persons in the biodiversity negotiations that is ongoing over the past couple of months, and hopefully continue in the next couple of months until very likely October 2021, which will be followed by the climate COP in Glasgow. So on behalf of ICLEI and LGMA community, I'd like to thank both Ingrid and John in their time and interest to join us, and I'm sure we will have interesting discussions. For today's agenda, I will spend the next 5 minutes for an update of what we have been achieving since the last webinar. Then I will give the floor to our colleagues. Ingrid will start to have a setting the scene about how we're engaged in the biodiversity process, and John will take us through the Edinburgh, let's say, post-2020 process. As I said, we will have Q&A sessions. Just to recap, the previous 4 webinars were held in February, March, April, and May, monthly. And here you can find access to the links to the presentations and the videos of all these past webinars. So in the next couple of minutes, let me continue our climate-specific updates because it has been one of the most busy months of the year. In that regard, just for those who are coming to this process very new, Paris Climate Agreement recognizes the importance of engagement of all levels of government. This is unique moment because that was not available in the UNFCCC nor in the Kyoto Protocol. So it's the result of 20 years of our advocacy efforts. There are specific paragraphs in the Paris Agreement. That's why it's not anymore a voluntary initiative of local and regional governments to act on climate, but it is part of our duty that Paris Climate Agreement is a multi-level and multi-stakeholder process. We can consider that this process was split into 2 phases. The process until 2015 was bottom-up processes like LGMA roadmap. We had negotiations in the UNFCCC ADP, and you had 2014 UN Climate Summit was instrumental And starting from Paris Agreement entering into force, we continue at our own advocacy as a constituency. We have Marrakesh Partnership, Talanoa dialogues. These are all milestones for us that we achieved. Significant process. 2018 Global Climate Action Summit and 2019 UN Climate Action Summit was also additional opportunities for making progress. This slide is being updated, therefore I put it as of June 2020. This is a cyclic process. The countries who host the past presidency or the past conference takes the responsibility for the year, and the one who will host it the next year starts to prepare and they take it over. Since Paris Agreement, there's also the modality of a champion, which is mainly focusing on non-party stakeholders. This is always shared in a June session or May in Bonn. What is new here is that, first of all, there is a June momentum that was created that this year we will just very shortly touch on it. We're expecting to have a session in official negotiations in October. And this month, on 28th of May, the UK presidency also announced the date of the COP26 in 2021. Plus, they also announced Friends of COP, which now includes Eric Garcetti as the mayor of Los Angeles and C40 chair, in addition to the official mandates of the presidency, which is COP26 President Mr. Alok Sharma, Nigel Topping as high-level champion, and Mark Carney. Every year we have a regular engagement process in the climate processes, showcasing participation in negotiations and consultations. And every year we also define our own agenda also, which is the same for the presidency. For us now, the multi-level COP in Glasgow has 6 elements, and it is very much aligned with the presidency's 5 priorities as well. As of May, we have created our working group. April, we have created our working group. Now it is consisting of 20 partners, more from regional and global levels and national levels. And we have 6 priority areas developed in specific agenda items that all these partners are now defining how they will lead it. And I think in the July webinar, we will go through more into details of all these agenda items of our roadmap. What has been achieved since the 13th of May? On the 22nd of May, there was International Biodiversity Day. Maybe we will hear from our colleagues. Mayor Valerie Plant was also actively involved in calling for action for nature, but also working on the other networks, also making the connection to climate as well. 28th of May was a unique moment. We had COP26 announcement came up, and on the same day we had ministerial mayoral dialogue on Paris Agreement. This was a unique initiative by UCLG, ICLEI, GCOM, UNEP, UNDP, and UNHabitat. And that was also kicking off a number of ideas. One of them is the working group by the GCOM on regional and local contributions. 5th of June, we have witnessed a mobilization globally. It was also the World Environment Day, but UNFCCC announced the new phase of climate action campaign, which is Race to Zero. And during this day, Beethoven Pastoral also announced the Artists Declaration. We will go through it, but it is also a contribution from the culture and arts community to climate action, which is endorsed by a number of local and regional governments. Just yesterday, on the 16th of June, UNHabitat released its NDC guide under the Urban Nets project, which is giving a flavor of how national governments can integrate urban action into their NDCs, which is the biggest topic of this year, as we have been working a lot. And I think this will also give us a huge opportunity when we go back home from now until the end of the year or COP. And then this guide and the working group on regional and local contributions will be really complementing each other, and that will constitute one of the major backbones of the LGMA COP26 roadmap towards making the COP26 a multi-level action COP. I will not go further, but here you can see the screenshots of those things that has happened, and I would be, of course, when we circulate this, we will provide the links to these events or announcements as well, so that you can track it later on. Actually, these are also shared during the LGMA regular briefings, but it is always good to capture all of this in one documentation. Here you can see the diversity of participants. It was from the 28th of May. We had 15 ministers, 30 plus mayors, and the heads of the 3 UN agencies. Race to Zero announcement was when Mayor of Kampala was representing local and regional governments. He's not part of the Race to Zero yet, but it is definitely in the most, let's say, close vicinity, because the goal of the champions, Nigel and Gonzalo, is that the current 500 cities or regions all around the world, they would like to reach to 10 times more newcomers. And obviously those cities who have announced their climate neutrality or they're active on climate action and biodiversity action are the ones that could be the first ones to come into this process. And collectively with all the partners, we are hoping that we will show in Glasgow an increased number of commitments, but also much more transparency about how are we tracking it. During this day, ICLEI released an assessment, or at least a summary of how Turku, Bonn, and Japan, including the dialogue with the Ministry of Environment of Japan, has been working on the Race to Zero. And on the same day, Korean municipalities, 200 of them have announced their climate emergency declarations, which is very likely also be in the next group of cities who are joining the commitment to climate neutrality with our engagement with them as well. Beethoven Artist Declaration was announced with the endorsement of Mayor of Bonn as the host of the Beethoven Pastoral Project, obviously, but it was also endorsed by Mayor of Izmir, who will host the UCLG Culture Summit. It was also endorsed by the Culture Minister of Buenos Aires, and as also UCLG co-chair of the Culture Committee and Climate Heritage Network, and a number of other local and regional leaders were endorsing this. It is announced by 250 plus signed artists worldwide, with endorsements from UN Secretary General and UN Environment and Minister for Environment of Germany as well. And the final list will be communicated to the UN later on during the year. And here's the website, or let's say screenshot of UN Habitat. But since it is released yesterday, we will have more opportunities to present the content of it, but it is an important tool for all of us. With this, I think it's time for me to welcome our colleagues, Ingrid and John. I will ask Marcelo, my colleague from the Secretariat of the ICLEI's Capacity Center, to shift the screen to Ingrid, so that we start listening from Ingrid how local and regional governments and subnational governments are engaged in the CBD process, and then we will continue with John in terms of the Edinburgh process. Any questions on our documentation, we can touch upon it in the Q&A session. Thanks a lot for your interest, and we are eager to hear from Ingrid and John.
Thank you, and let's hope this works. All right. Can people see my screen?
Yes, Ingrid, they can.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, so I'm just going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour on what's happened in the biodiversity space, advocacy space, in relation to the Convention on Biological Diversity over the past decade. This is a space that ICLEI has been very, very involved in and has played a leading role for since actually before the past decade. And I thought I would just share the major milestones. There's obviously too much information to give everything. And just before I do that, also just to say that in respect of the biodiversity, the CBD, ICLEI plays a similar role as in the climate space, in that we coordinate the network partners and the inputs on behalf of the global task force. So just quickly, if we look at this year, this is called the super year for biodiversity, and in a sense it started already 2018 at the last convention of number 14, because what's happening is that the current biodiversity strategy comes to an end this year. So within the CBD, we need to have a new strategy, and that's for the next decade, 2030 and up to 2015. And the process of negotiation started already in 2018. And last year and this year, we've seen a very intensive negotiation and awareness raising and lobbying process. And on this roadmap, and I'll expand on it a little bit later when I give you a bit of the history, is that ICLEI has played through our various networks and our network partners, which include the Committee of Regions, European Committee of Regions, Regions 4, the Goals Group. They are the group of leading subnational governments in relation to the IT biodiversity targets. and then the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments, we have created this roadmap, which is linked to the CBD process, and we have engaged and made interventions on behalf of the local and subnational government constituency along this road towards the COP15, which was going to take place at the end of this year, and now, as in the case of the climate COP, is also being postponed to next year. And you'll see there these dots represent major points within the CBD process. The SAPSTA, which is the technical meetings, they happen every 6 months. And then there's also been the implementation meetings. The next ones are in that box that's outlined, which is supposed to be going to be late October. There's some talk maybe even in November. And in addition to the CBD meetings, we are also influencing the space through other meetings. For example, through the UNFCCC, there was a presentation, quite a lot of interventions last year at the COP, as well as the World Urban Forum, Daring Cities. We envisage to do something there as well. There's a number of these interventions that we're, hang on, what's happened there? Sorry, I seem to have lost my screen. Okay, so then also I think that the idea of this roadmap is to make sure that there's a coordinated voice coming from the local and subnational governments. And now what I want to do now is just step back a little bit and have a look at the history over the past decade. In around about 2008, there was a very important meeting which took place at the COP in Bonn, which was the first time where there were local government representations gathered together in a meeting of mayors. And this, in a sense, was one of the sort of, it's the biggest milestone in the sense that it also started a sort of tradition where, as a result of the lobbying and the influencing and the gathering of local government and subnational government representation, we saw for the first time that CBD decisions started reflecting the need to recognize the role that local governments and subnational governments can make in playing and in influencing the implementation of the CBD and its various subsidiary protocols and agreements. And there has been, over the past decade, at least one decision every year that's been influenced by local and subnational governments, driven by ICLEI. And then obviously this tempo has increased. And then in 2010, the decision 1022, which you see on the screen, was adopted. And this is an important decision because it was the first decision within a Rio Convention that specifically recognized the role that local governments can play, and it set out a plan of action. Now, this plan of action also comes to an end at the end of this year, and what we are pushing for and lobbying for at the moment is that we have a renewed plan of action and a strengthened and much more ambitious decision that is specifically dedicated to the very active participation of local governments going forward. Up till now, it's been quite tentative. It's been sort of suggesting, encouraging, but we want something that's a lot stronger and that has a lot more clear targets. Something else that's also important in the past 2 years, and Yunus mentioned it, is the advisory group on biodiversity mainstreaming. There's a lot of emphasis on mainstreaming. It's being basically touted as the main mechanism to ensure the curve of biodiversity loss is arrested and turned. And it's being used as an instrument also to ensure that local and subnational governments are recognized. And there's a very important recommendation included there that specifically speaks to, within one of the 3 strategic areas that speaks to this. Something else that we've done in the past also is we've appointed a global ambassador for local biodiversity, which at the moment is represented by Mayor Plant, and she plays an important role in raising awareness, in visibility, and in calling cities to join this movement. Our network partners I have mentioned, and then, just the other point that I want to make is that if we look at the decisions over the past, one of the things that we've noticed has happened is increasingly local and subnational governments have started taking their own initiative, have implemented programs and actions, and also national governments are increasingly recognizing that their counterparts at the local levels with their own specific mandates and jurisdictions can contribute. So we've seen also through the interventions and the coordination by ICLEI that there's been other networks that have come on board and strengthened this movement. For example, I've mentioned already Regions 4, whom we work very closely with, as well as the Committee of Regions. And some of you will be aware of the European Biodiversity Strategy that came out recently. And in that document, you are also seeing that there is a strong role given for local and governments. So basically, just in summary to say that this is a process that ICLEI has been involved in for more than 10 years. We've seen over the 10 years an increase in not only the level of participation and involvement by local governments in the biodiversity space, but specifically also the intensity and the ambition of local governments, and the fact that within the global space at the level of the CBD and the Bureau, as well as at national level, that role is being recognized increasingly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ingrid. And I think we don't have to spend too much time and immediately start with John to hear how Edinburgh Process contributes and takes it forward towards COP15. So John, the floor is yours. You can also share your screen and we will be listening to your interventions.
Okay, can you see my screen at the moment?
No, John, perhaps you received a message in your screen saying that you can start showing the presentation.
Okay.
Marcelo, maybe we can guide John that on the upper menu there's a sharing. Will he click on that one? Marcelo?
Yeah, there's a tab sharing in the GoToMeeting application, and then you can click the big play button, say show your screen, or as I made you.
I'm just having it's not liking it for some reason. Let me just
Marcelo, can we enable him to show his screen from our side, from the coordination?
Yeah. Okay, now we can see it.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Right, let's see if I can get this going. Sorry, I was just I wasn't liking something good about my settings for some reason there.
Yeah, this computer's is making our lives easy, but sometimes they're making our lives hell.
Right, I think okay, we're ready to go. Sorry about that, folks. Good morning, everybody, or good morning for me anyway. Thanks for the invite to talk here. I'd just like to follow up on what Ingrid said by focusing a little bit more detail on the Edinburgh process, which for local and subnational governments, and talking a little bit more in detail about the CBD Post2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which Ingrid introduced. Obviously, this is a big year for Scotland, not only having the towards scene, but also having COP26 hosted by the UK government in Scotland in the 1st to the 12th of November. So there's a lot of focus on both of these and trying to make the obvious links between the biodiversity and climate change agendas. As Ingrid introduced, the CBD at the moment is in the process of developing the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And while the targets will focus on the next 10 years, it's also setting out the process right up till the 2020 vision of living in harmony with nature and how we're going to get there. We're currently working through the open-ended working group, which is the group that's developing this framework in an open and participatory manner. There's been 3 phases. So phase 1 was we're currently in phase 2, moving to phase 3. Phase 2 had a series of thematic issues. So it focused in on things like resource mobilization, capacity building, particular topics like protected areas or marine and coastal biodiversity. And one of those thematic issues is also the role of subnational local governments, which is where the Edinburgh process fits in. And we're now just about to move into the 3rd phase of the open-ended working group, which is then the real negotiation of the post-2020 framework and actually negotiating the goals and targets that will be adopted at COP15 later next year. Now, obviously, there's a strong role for subnational and local governments because in most countries around the world, they have a responsibility. In Scotland, most biodiversity policy is completely devolved to the Scottish government from the national level, and in Europe, I think 70% of biodiversity legislation is taken on by subnational or local governments. So there's a strong link there in terms of biodiversity when you're looking at landscape and protected areas, the science and knowledge and monitoring, quality of life and health focus, both urban and rural, and then also in the strange times we're living in, how we recover from the current COVID crisis and have a new social and economic paradigm following that. So the Zero Draft itself is broken down into a number of sections. We have the overall vision, CBD Vision for 2050. At the moment, there's a series of goals setting the pathway between 2030 and 2050. And probably where most of the focus for us is in terms of the 2030 action targets and also the implementing actions, because that's where the reference to the involvement of subnational and local governments are, resource mobilization, capacity building, and a lot of areas that are important to ensure that subnational governments can take their role in implementing the targets. So as part of that overall development and as part of the open-ended working group, the Scottish Government volunteered to hold a Edinburgh Workshop, as it was at the time, to bring together the subnational and local government community to discuss the Zero Draft and the proposed targets in detail, to discuss specific topics such as climate and biodiversity and nature-based solutions, and to provide that feedback into the subsidiary bodies of the CBD and to the open-ended working group to inform the negotiations going forward. obviously, as part of that, it's not just the Scottish Government on its own. We're very lucky to have a really strong group of international partners, of which ICLEI is, of course, one of the main partners working towards that. But we also have Region 4 goals, Quebec, the Welsh Government, the UK Government, and the Committee of the Regions in Europe. So we're bringing together the subnational community to make sure we can engage with everybody going forward. As with everything at the moment, we've had to change our plans. Originally, we'd planned to host a 3-day workshop, physical workshop in Edinburgh for around 200 delegates. Of course, we quickly realised that wasn't going to be possible anymore, and then to ensure we could still engage as many people as possible, we've switched to a completely online Edinburgh process, which involves consultations on the plan of action that Ingrid mentioned, the zero draft, and Edinburgh Declaration. We've also had a series of thematic webinars, which I'll come to in a minute. And that's been quite a successful process. I think we have 400 people registered into that process. The timeline we're working to at the moment is that we've had a first round of information sessions in the 5th, 8th of May. Two of the consultations are online on the zero draft and the plan of action. We've had 4, and we're now working towards a second information session because 2 of the main consultations have closed. The Edinburgh process doesn't finish once we've had our consultations and written the report to feed back into the CBD process. We'll continue with the collaboration right up until COP15. Part of the process of gathering information was to have some more detailed thematic sessions, and perhaps the most interest for this group of the 2 is the ones on nature-based solutions and climate change and biodiversity, because they were really focusing on the links between the 2 agendas and highlighting that in order to tackle climate change, you really need to also address biodiversity loss, that the 2 go hand in hand. We had a very well-attended webinar on climate change and biodiversity with about 150 participants, where we discussed the evidence-based linking climate and biodiversity through the IPBES assessment, on implementing nature-based solutions for climate and biodiversity, in particular focusing on the role of subnational governments, and then discussing with some state party representatives the convergence between the climate and biodiversity agendas and how they can really be taken forward in parallel at the national level. So the consultation on the zero draft has now just closed. It actually just closed on last Friday. We have 77 written responses, which I'm trying to read through and review at the moment, and that will form the basis of our report back to the CBD. In terms of the next steps for the Edinburgh process, at the moment we're working on some of the outcomes. So the Edinburgh process report will be based on those consultations being drafted at the moment, and we aim to submit that to the CBD at the end of July. Ingrid will be busily doing the same for the subnational plan of action and reviewing the responses they've received on that. And then the next step, which we're hoping to launch consultation on very shortly, is the Edinburgh Declaration. So along with the more kind of formal process of submitting a report summarising the views of the subnational and local government community to the CBD, we're also developing a high-level political declaration, which we hope will be open for signature up to COP15. Obviously, it would have been the kind of one of the main parts negotiated at the workshop, but we'll now do that through an online process. And the Edinburgh Declaration will focus on a few areas, so reducing threats to biodiversity, making sure we meet people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing, developing the tools and solutions that subnational governments need, and then the actions that subnational local governments themselves are going to take to implement and mainstream the new framework. So the draft declaration will open for comment shortly. After that kind of consultation period, the Scottish Government and Edinburgh Process partners will agree and sign the final version, and then as I said, it will be open for signature to COP15, and we hope to gather strong support from the subnational community so that we can present that at a side event at COP15. So that was a very brief run through the process. We're in that kind of phase of writing the final reports and feeding in the views, and I'm welcome to take any more detailed questions as we move on to the question and answer session.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Ingrid, both of you, to take us through this very dynamic and well, let's say, organized and very important process that you're taking on through the Biodiversity Convention. And have also for your sticking to your time so that we can have now the Q&A with our colleagues who are attending this webinar. I'm just checking whether there's any points raised by any participants so far. I don't see any, but maybe I can kick off because I am also relatively outsider. My first biodiversity COP was Sharm el Sheikh in 2018 in Egypt. Obviously, I am trying to make this, let's say, I don't want to say comparison, but let's say analogy or overlaps or differentiation between the climate process, which is, of course, it's interesting because, for example, it's interesting how we have been involved. For example, in the way when we were working towards Bonn COP in 2008, there was also this process for Copenhagen. In the case of biodiversity, what I feel is that parties see the subnationals, local and all municipal governments, much more partner to their efforts. Whereas for a long time in the climate process, it was a taboo, let's say. And then maybe this was also because of the very dense political and maybe financial complexities of the climate process. You know, Copenhagen failed and it was taking time to build that back to the process. Biodiversity never had seen that kind of a tensions, let's say, process. Yes, they couldn't meet their goals of IHG targets, but there was not too much breakthroughs like Copenhagen. But now there are lessons learned. For example, I remember in Sharm el Sheikh, we were saying that in the climate process, there was a Paris moment, and we want Kunming to be the Paris of biodiversity process, which is giving much more impetus and much more momentum in terms of implementation. I think that would be very important in terms of the advantage of having an action plan. I think one of the biggest assets of our constituency is to have an action plan within a multilateral process. And I think, and I know ICLEI is working on this to demonstrate how an action plan is helping helping national governments to advance their efforts. I think the more we can quantify and the more we can visualize the benefit of such an action plan, the more we can also convince others like UNFCCC for an action plan for cities or for cities and subnationals. Because this notion of, for example, multi-level collaboration, as I said, it was existing in the CBD starting from 2008 onwards, but it came to UNFCCC only in 2015 onwards. But whereas in the climate space, there is also a strong discussion about the NDC targets, raising the global level of ambition through local and subnational ambitions. So we have to take lessons learned from each other. And obviously, the Edinburgh, let's say, taking a voluntary step to host such a process and having this recognized by the Secretariat is also a very interesting experience. My just point, I mean, as these were not necessarily comment questions, but rather a comment. Maybe in the next steps, it would also be good to have also a further discussion with the host government, which is China, where we are observing from remotely at least, but also we have our members in China, ICLEI office in Beijing. It is an interesting thing because we have seen in the biodiversity and the climate process, the host country always has an important role to play in terms of the ambition of the outcomes. And even the title, Harmony with Nature, it is also making the discussions that, and that was what we were discussing with the COVID, with all these challenges. It's not anymore just a biodiversity thing that we are looking for. It's not just a CBD discussion. Therefore, we have to make it much more ambitious, and that's maybe one concrete proposal and connection, maybe if you want, and I would conclude because we have started to receive comments and questions. The declaration and the interim results, I heard from John that you want to present the declaration or conclude action in Kunming, but maybe it may be better to have it earlier in order to start to create a pressure before COP, because we all know things conclude a bit more earlier, and COP is more or less a bit, let's say, final phases. In that sense, I think you mentioned both Ingrid and John, the Biodiversity Summit in September, and I think because of COVID, it will again turn into virtuality, but let's make sure during the year that we start to put more pressure and much more recognition earlier than the COP itself. These were my, let's say, just an outsider in that sense, that I'm not an expert from the biodiversity field, but knowing the challenges between or knowing the opportunities from climate, I think we have to be thinking bigger and we have to be ambitious and make use of the opportunities, especially in the biodiversity, which is, from my side, in one of the most advanced for local and regional governments in the rest of the multilateral environmental agreements. So these are my just remarks. You can think about maybe just think of your reactions, but maybe in the meantime, I can also read a comment from Monica Zimmerman, a longtime ICLEI leader and friend. I'm reading her question. Maybe, Monica, I'm not sure whether you want to speak yourself. We can unmute you if you want. But let me read it. Maybe then she can come into the. Yeah, she says that if it's okay if I read it, and maybe once you receive the feedbacks from John and Ingrid, Monica can also speak. So her question is this: this figure of 70% biodiversity legislation is on subnational level in Europe is very interesting. Can you please further explain and tell us the source of this figure? That's the question from Monica. I think, of course, that goes to John because he was mentioning it, but Ingrid, feel free to intervene if needed, just also not only this question, but also the ones that I mentioned about. So we don't have any new one. Maybe we can start with John, and you can start with this question, but also you can continue if there's anything you want to add further, please.
Yeah, I can't claim credit for that statistic. That actually comes from our colleague Roberto from the Committee of the Regions, who have been looking into the implementation of biodiversity across the European scale. So they've made that assessment. But I know from personal experience in the UK that biodiversity policy is in our system has devolved to Scotland. So we have the main responsibility for implementing biodiversity legislation. Our national biodiversity strategy forms one quarter of the UK NBSAP, which is the equivalent of the national contributions in the climate process, and we're responsible for the monitoring. So I think there's a lot of areas where regions and subnational governments and local governments do have quite a bit of responsibility for that. I think on your point, Yunus, I think definitely we need to continue to make the contacts with China as host country, and also with the region of Yunnan and Kunming. it's a shame we didn't have our Edinburgh Workshop in the Royal Botanic Gardens, because they're actually twinned with the Kunming Botanic Gardens, and we have good connections with the province. So we had a really nice connection there, and it's a shame that we couldn't build on that because of the COVID issues. But I think as we move towards COP, we'll also be using with our government office in Beijing, looking to make ensure we make the right contacts, and I'm sure Inger will be doing the same through ICLEI and using ICLEI China contacts. On your one last point on, you mentioned the declaration. We will be making that public as soon as we've had the initial consultation and the Edinburgh Process partners have signed it. So the idea would be that would be publicised probably over the summer, but it would remain open for signature right up until COP. So we would continue to work to gather more subnational governments to sign up to that declaration. So we have a strong front to present at the COP to support the other work that's going in terms of the detailed discussions and responses to the zero draft and the plan of action as well.
Yeah, and maybe I can just come in here. That's absolutely so. In fact, you'll remember that timeline I showed, the SABSTA and the SBI meetings, and then there's the open-ended working group meetings. So those are the sort of milestone events where we make these policy interventions. And it's very much part of how the whole the new global biodiversity framework is being negotiated. So those are certainly very important places where you make your positions known and you engage in discussions. I think, you know, this question about local governments within the CBD, why? And it has been for so long. It's because of the nature of the beast, if I can call it that way. Biodiversity is at the local level. We talk ecosystems and we talk landscapes. And the action, as Francis Ogwell, one of the co-chairs, said in one of the Edinburgh introductory messages, he was saying that the action in biodiversity certainly is at the local level. And if you don't get it right at the local level, then you're not going to make an impact, you know, because species and their habitats function in ecosystems, and they are localized, and they differ from region to region. And that in one way is, I think, a reason why local governments and subnational governments have always been a lot more involved. But on the other level, it makes it very difficult to come up with these so-called apex targets, because what might work for one biome is certainly not going to work for a next. And I think that that's also one of the reasons. And remember, the ecosystems approach is one of the principles underpinning the CBD. But it does make negotiation and setting around targets really complex and difficult. And then I think the other thing that's really important about the CBD process is the realization that mainstreaming is the way to go. And there's a lot of this, and it's been something that's been around also for the past decade or so. It's evolved a lot, and it's certainly been integrated within the CBD process and decisions. But it's really coming into its own now. And I think that it's, in the past, it used to be quite sectoral. It would be mainstreaming in the agriculture production sector or mining or whatever. And what we're seeing more recently is that, and this is something that we in ICLEI have pushed very much for, is the need for vertical integration as well. And you have to bring in the local governments, particularly in terms of things like land use planning, where local governments can influence disaster risk reduction planning and all of those sorts of things.
Excellent. I think I mean, recalling again from the climate perspective, also the SDG discussions, and in the afternoon we will also have a discussion on land and desertification. This convergence and holistic approach, thinking out of silos, both inside the process but also across process, is something that becoming more and more urgent, and also more effective in the sense that at the many cases we are not implementing not necessarily actions because by their CBD asks for us or UNFCCC, but we know that there's a common sense to live with nature, to be public, let's say, services, to make it renewables, and to make it much more resource efficient, or or less emitting is a common sense, and I think we have to make sure our decisions are appropriately guided, but also relevant to the all efforts. And in that sense, this obviously this SDGs is something that we are also benefiting a lot, that the nations, it's not just anymore the agenda of environment ministers, it is much more higher, even in the cities or regions. It's the premiers, the governors, the mayors are talking about this concept. It's not anymore our experts are only the environment mayors or environment ministers of the leadership. These are all positive things, I think, making us much more stronger to be asking for more. And I think these are the things we have to take benefit of. What I could, maybe there's another comment from Monica, is she's asking which type of legislation. Maybe as a follow-up after this call, in your presentation, we can bundle all the three presentations, and you may add several links, for example, John and Ingrid. For example, the document for Committee of the Regions have a position paper of the European Committee of the Regions. We can make that linkage so that this is answered. And maybe, Ingrid, we could refer also this the document. I know there's a draft at the moment that you're working on the assessment of the plan of action, but I know, for example, that there is guidelines, for example, implementation of national biodiversity strategy plans with the local and subnational. We just saw the UN Habitat having this NDC guide, so that this kind of availability of guidance documents are also giving the ministers of environment a bit more confidence that they can do what we are asking for, or it's not impossible to materialize it. And maybe we should also think about this. We were discussing about in the UNFCCC, the climate process, NDC, and the local contributions. This, Ingrid, you were mentioning about the availability of much more documentation of action plans of cities and states and regions, and how they are visible in the national ones. The more we make it clear, or good cases, the more we could ask others. We have seen this coming up in the climate space. There are more and more countries who are referring to local and regional contributions. This is from Japan to Indonesia to Chile to Ivory Coast, South Africa. So the more we can compile evidence of the availability of such multi-level approach coming up, I think is also something that we can benefit. And also, obviously, the role of the ministers of urbanization, that it is not a minister of environment outside. It is the same government but different ministry, but they should also talk to each other, and that is also what we are trying to achieve over these years. And for example, in Glasgow COP, for example, we aim to have ministers of urbanization in addition to ministers of energy in the climate space, for example. The same goes to the biodiversity COP. Obviously, 2021 will be a crazy year. Everything that is postponed from 2020 will overlap. We will have 3 COPs, the biodiversity, land, and climate. We will have UN Environment Assembly. We will have G7 and G20. Obviously, 2021 will be crazy. And if I don't envy the position of the ministers of environment or the staff of the environment, let's say, ministries. Even just attending these events is occupying, let's say, 1 month is gone with all these meetings and participation and travel. So, and I'm sure after COVID, the mode of the meetings will also change, so that some of those practices we will not be doing, and we will introduce more this online consultations. We have seen the benefits that the more online processes coming up, as you mentioned, hundreds of people. We also had summits in the past, but having so many contributions in the online process is making us much more confident that our support is there. So these are ideas. And one final thing, I mean, again, I would suggest that I will also, I shouldn't talk too much, but in the afternoon, I would like to connect to the afternoon again. For example, as I said, in the biodiversity, there was a positive essence. In climate, it came better. And in the desertification, it's even different, because then in the desertification, we as cities or urban spaces are seen as the other side. I don't want to call us enemy, but those who are against us. But now we are seeing there's a decision on local governments in the desertification, land use planning, expansion of urban sprawl, and instead of urban sprawl, focusing on urban ecology, urban biodiversity, urban food, city food. These are really modern and progressive approaches that these are not against each other, but we are all part of the same puzzle and part of the same picture. Maybe this is the type of message that we should convey in the next couple of days to our community and to the national governments and the UN processes. Maybe I could invite you to make your concluding remarks. I don't see new comments coming yet from the chat box. Marcelo, do you see any hands raised? So that we don't ignore anyone.
No, I don't see any raised hands.
Okay, let's then have last round. I will not make the last round. I talked already. John and Ingrid. Let's start with Ingrid and conclude with John.
Okay, thanks, Yunus. I mean, this has been a really great webinar. It's really nice to have the convergence between the different conventions. I think just on the last point, the 2 points that I haven't made yet, the one is, and you triggered it for me, is the urban-rural linkages. And I think that is something that we're seeing increasingly, not just within the city context coming up, but also within the CBD process. The sort of flows, resource flows and the wastes and those sorts of things. That's the one. The other one is certainly, yes, the impact that COVID has had, not just now as a pandemic, but going forward, and how we can, in UN speak, build back better. And there's a real concern that we get it right this time in terms of consumption and production patterns, in terms of urbanization, sprawl, and all of those sorts of things. So with those last few words, I'll hand over to John.
Yeah, thanks. And I think just taking your point that next year really is going to be a super year, and it's the opportunity for us to make those linkages between different processes and ensure that they reinforce each other. It's going to be a big year for Scotland, with working towards the COP, but also having COP15, but also having COP26 here in Glasgow, and I'm sure I'll be busy helping contribute to that when we come up to it. So I think it's going to be a busy few months ahead, but looking forward to making sure we ensure that those links are taken forward and that we get the voices of national and local governments in there. Excellent.
We wish you the best of luck in your efforts, and we will be continuing to collaborate and share our experiences. I think we will. This is the first time we did this, but I hope it will not be the last one. And good luck to all your work, and thanks a lot for all your participation, also our attendees and participants in this webinar. So now I'd like to invite a closure of the session and wish you all the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.